All right, next we will have the ACLU.
You're always so good at that.
Oh, you know.
I appreciate you. Go. That's good. And then just press the key. Thank you so much.
Morning, Mr. Bruce. Nice to see you.
Hey, good to see you too, Chairman.
Welcome.
Chairwoman.
The podium is yours.
Happy to be here. And to all the other members of the Joint Redistricting Committee, thank you for being here today. And thank you for allowing the ACLU of Georgia to speak. My name is Christopher Bruce. I'm the Policy Director of the ACLU of Georgia. I am joined by our Legal Director, Sean Young, who will be speaking as well. And the purpose of this is to let you know that the ACLU is 100% into redistricting. The political department, the legal department, all of the departments, as well as our executive director, have made redistricting a priority since we've gotten it here. And let me tell you a little bit about the ACLU if you haven't heard of it before. We really envision a state that guarantees civil rights and civil liberties to all Georgians that are enshrined in our United States Constitution, as well as our Georgia Constitution. And we do that through 3 different ways. That's with legal action, really more legislative advocacy, and of course, civic engagement within your communities that you represent. So representing the ACLU, we have members in all 159 counties in the state of Georgia. And we were talking to our members, we were really asking them, what do they want in the redistricting process? Now, if you were in the General Assembly back in 2018, you may have been familiar with another piece of legislation called the Democracy Act. It really called for fairness and standards and transparency within the redistricting process. So this presentation may not be too new to you because we're asking for the same thing, really asking for transparency within this process, meaningful public input, making it easier for people to be able to comment on the process, and of course, a reflection of the diversity in our state. We received the census data. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I do want to recognize some highlights of this altogether. The total population of Georgia has gone up 10.6%. That is an incredible increase for this state's population. And looking at the factors that go within it, of a -1% for the non-Hispanic white population, the Black population jumping plus 12%, the Asian population jumping over 50%, and of course the Hispanic population jumping over 30% as well. So not only looking at that, let's look at the standards that go within the voting age population within the state of Georgia. Still an increase that's happening of over 14% in the voting age population overall. Non-Hispanic whites jumping up again 2%, the Black population over 18%, Asian 57%, and the Hispanic population of 37%. So those are some brief numbers, but we can get some takeaways from that altogether. Looking at the Black voting age population, which grew significantly within the last decade of over 19%. So to put that in perspective, back in last redistricting times of 2010, you had 45 Black majority districts in the state of Georgia. Even with the Black population age growing, it has currently cut down to 42. So looking at, despite the growth in the Black population, there are actually fewer Black majority districts that are enacted under the current acts, the current maps that we're currently under. Now, the Black voting age population has grown significantly, and it's really realized with an increased overpacking in overpopulated districts, something that you should take into consideration. So the growth and diversity in the state of Georgia is just going to continue as projected for the years to come. We need to take into consideration a lot of things, including the children factor within this when it comes to increasing the population, which leads to the risk of gerrymandering altogether. The Brennan Center has said itself that the state with the highest risk for gerrymandering is the state of Georgia. So again, Georgia is leading within one factor within this altogether. Georgia's maps may not require pre-clearance under the current, in the next redistricting cycle due to the Shelby case, but this committee should make sure and ensure that maps comply with federal and constitutional requirements to avoid legal standards. And going into those legal standards, I'm going to bring up my legal director, Sean Young. Sean?
Thanks for having me, and I'll try not to be too repetitive. The legal requirements for redistricting involve the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the US Constitution. Under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, it requires that people of color have an equal opportunity to participate in the political process and elect candidates of their choice. The analysis is based on the totality of the circumstances. And basically, Section 2 forbids redistricting maps that dilute the voting power of people of color. As has been covered earlier, very briefly, vote dilution can be established if the following jingles preconditions have been met. A district can be drawn in which a minority group is sufficiently large and geographically compact to constitute a majority. The minority group is politically cohesive, and white majority voters sufficiently vote as a bloc to defeat usually the minority group's preferred candidates. But kind of to boil down a few points in English is, number one, I think the general approach you should think about is this. When you're looking at a map, ask yourself, are you making it harder for communities of color to elect candidates of their choice? If you are, then you might want to go back to council a little bit. The second point I want to make, and I think Representative Kauser made a really good point about the political cohesion or political polarization point. If you have a jurisdiction in which voting patterns are not politically polarized, in which people of all different races tend to consider the candidates and the political parties roughly on par with each other, or vote one way or vote the other way, depending on the election, you're in less danger of having a Voting Rights Act violation. But if you're in a jurisdiction where it's very polarized, then you have to look a lot more carefully. The third point I wanted to make is about communities of interest, which are talked about a lot. When you use communities of interest as a factor, if you choose to do so, you really got to make sure that it's not masquerading for race. So for example, sometimes several years ago, there was an attempt to draw several thousand white voters into one district and several thousand black voters out of a district. And the justification that was used was, well, we're trying to protect suburban communities of interest. And number one, suburbans are obviously not a racial monolith, but you have to be careful when you look at communities of interest, not to use that as a masquerade for committing a Voting Rights Act violation. The two most common ways in which the Voting Rights Act is violated is through cracking and packing. Cracking refers to the fragmenting concentrations of minority populations and dispersing them among other districts to basically dilute their vote, to ensure that other districts remain majority white. Packing, which is actually the tactic that has seen a little bit of popularity in recent years, is concentrating as many people of color as possible in as few districts as possible to minimize the number of majority minority districts. Specifically, we have really seen situations where, let's say you have a majority black district held at about 55% majority black. The next census rolls around and everyone thinks, well, we should keep it 55%. But in the 10 years that have followed, many people may have left that district and diversify the surrounding areas. And so map makers will then redraw the map to recapture all of those people of color that have dispersed out and say, no, we got to keep it at 55% mechanically without doing any kind of nuanced analysis. That, the Supreme Court has found, can present a problem. And so we have to make sure that when you do a voting rights analysis, that you really consult with counsel and make sure you're doing a nuanced analysis, not an automatic percentage, and ensuring that you're not unintentionally packing minority voters in an inappropriate manner. And under the US Constitution, I think most people are familiar with this, you gotta have one person, one vote. Districts have to be equal in population for congressional districts and almost roughly equal in population for state legislative districts. And as was discussed earlier, race cannot generally be the predominant factor in drawing district lines. I'm gonna turn it back over to my colleague.
Thank you, Sean. And we are going to finish up the last parts of this to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So we'd love to hear from the committee. So looking at going back to fairness and transparency, again, asking our members and people from the public, really, what do they want within this process? And that's simple. It's that they want a criteria for the maps to provide substantial feedback on the draft maps. So looking at draft maps, we should make sure that it's publicly available to everyone, easy to decipher. A lot of times these maps are drawn in codes that most people do not have the resources to read or to actually really analyze. This has not been the case previously. So transparency also requires that the public receive adequate notice of meetings and the meetings accessible to all people. So it's great that we're doing these things virtually and also in person, but we also want to make sure that the people are having adequate notice within the process. Our calls really deal with diversity, something that we had talked about earlier. For example, HBCUs in the state of Georgia. Very diverse campuses, but some of them are in different districts altogether. So this makes voting and civic engagement more accessible for students if they're actually within each other. So for example, the AUC, which composes Morehouse, Spelman, and Clark Atlanta University and Morris Brown, split up into different House districts and also different Senate districts, something that you should take into consideration. Georgians deserve fair maps. So in the current atmosphere that we have of misinformation, dealing with transparency, fairness, are key to preserving faith within this process and confidence within our democracy. The growing diversity in our state, this changed from 2010 to 2021, we must draw maps that ensure voters of color have the same opportunity to elect as a choice of everyone else within this state. So fair maps are crucial for preserving our democracy. With that, I'll yield to questions with my legal director.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bruce. And we have, who's 25? Is that, oh, Senator Cowser.
Mr. Chairman, can I direct this to Mr. Young? I think he was the legal director.
I saw that coming. Thank
Yes, sir.
You're off the hook.
I sincerely apologize for calling you Representative Cowser.
I'm not worried about that.
It's going to be a long morning for you, sir.
You were mentioning that, Section 2 applies to this process. I had asked the previous speaker, but basically, is it your position we are required to draw majority minority districts to comply with Section 2?
Depending on the circumstances, yes. And that's why it's such a nuanced analysis. You have to look at the history of voting in this specific jurisdiction. You have to look at whether there are geographically compact communities of color, whether they've been able to elect candidates of their choice or not. And if not, then you may need to ensure that there's a sufficient number of people of color in the district to elect candidates of their choice.
So what's the nuance there? Sufficient number versus majority minority?
So sufficient number meaning it depends on voting patterns. So for example, and I'm going to oversimplify a lot of factors, but in one district, you might need a 50% Black voting age population to ensure that candidates of their choice are elected. But in another district, it might be 55% or 45%. It just depends on the analysis in that jurisdiction.
Well, is it your belief that our voting is racially polarized here in Georgia?
Based on the cases that I am familiar with in Georgia, the answer so far has been yes, in those jurisdictions in which lawsuits have been filed.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Nix, didn't see your light on. Yes, sir, you have the mic.
Thank you. Mr. Bruce mentioned early on, talking about the growth in population, that the minority populations have grown in a more compact area. How do we work with that in terms of the compactness of the area, the communities of interest, and how do we draw those maps to include that, but yet not look like we're packing an area? That kind of created its own issue with the way that the population grew. So how do you define the community of interest, and then how do you prioritize? Is it compactness we're looking for, or is it community of interest we're looking for as we draw the maps?
I think to answer your question in a more technical manner, Voting Rights Act trumps everything other than the U.S. Constitution. I think one way you start with is by looking at the district that you're redrawing, and again, looking at those voting patterns and seeing if communities of color have been able to elect candidates of their choice, and what percentage of that district is people of color. What is that percentage that has been able to allow them to do that? If the population has started to disperse, and you don't need such a high percentage of people of color to elect candidates of their choice, then you likely should not be redrawing to recapture all of those folks that have dispersed. And so that's what I would start with, is the voting history of the district you're redrawing.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Chairman Mullis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. Mr. Bruce, this is for you. In your presentation at the beginning, you talked about pre-clearance. Do you think Georgia should be placed back into the pre-clearance category and now therefore be under the Biden administration for pre-clearance?
Well, thank you for the question, Chair. And I absolutely believe that pre-clearance should be implemented again, and also the passage of HR 1 and HR 4, the For the People's Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It doesn't matter about the administration. It really matters about justice overall.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, with that, we are closing in on our 20 minutes, and I don't see any other questions. Yes, sir.
I'm just going to make one more comment.
Sure.
It has been a pleasure to be in front of you all of these times. There has been an ACLU member at every one of the meetings and hearings, or we've had ACLU members actually there, or staff members there, and they've really enjoyed the process. They want more from it, though. So it's really invigorating the community. The more you talk to them, the more feedback you'll get.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Bruce. Thanks for being with us this morning.